Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Jason Bockenstead. I'm Chief of Staff for Mayor Ethan Berkowitz, and we wanted to take another opportunity to run through the slideshow and presentation that we gave to the Assembly last week. For those that were unable to watch it online, we wanted to give folks another opportunity to also ask us questions. So I'm going to run through the PowerPoint presentation that we gave last week, and then we'll switch over to taking questions and trying to answer all of the questions that folks will ask. With us tonight, I have a number of folks from the administration that will assist me in answering some of the questions. We have Chris Schutte, who's the Director of the Office of Economic and Community Development. We have Nancy Burke, who works in the Mayor's office and is our Housing and Homeless Coordinator. We have Robin Ward, the municipality's real estate director, along with Jasmine Boyle, who's the executive director of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. So with that, I'm going to jump into the presentation and look forward to seeing some questions come through. So obviously we're here to discuss AO 2020-66. It's the ordinance that would authorize the acquisition of 4 properties throughout town. We'll get into that, but I was just going to run through the what we're going to discuss tonight. So we're going to discuss why are we here? What is making us, or what is the public health emergency that has put us in this position? How has COVID-19 impacted our shelter capacity? What federal stimulus is out there? I think there's been a lot of discussion about not just the specific piece of the pie that the municipality has received, but a lot of the other federal stimulus that has been passed over the last 6 months. Specifically, we want to talk about the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is actually where the $156 million or so that the municipality has received. This is the actual piece of the CARES Act where that is coming from. We want to talk about some of the planning that has gone into this over the last couple of years that's led us to this decision, and then ultimately how COVID has made us or led us to this decision. We're going to talk a little bit actually about the ordinance. We'll run through the properties, what we believe some of the operating costs and what some of the expenses are going to be, and how the administration will plan on paying for those services. And then we're going to run through some of the questions that both the administration but also the Assembly has received, and then obviously we'll go through a lot of the questions that will be coming in over the next half an hour or so as we run through this presentation. So starting off with the public health emergency, why are we here? And certainly that is because of COVID-19. And on March 11th, the Governor Dunleavy, declared a public health disaster in Alaska on March 11th. This has since been extended legislatively through SB 241 to November the 15th. So the state, unless the governor rescinds this order, will be under a declaration of emergency until November 15th. A day later, on March the 12th, Mayor Berkowitz also issued a proclamation of emergency that has been extended in much shorter dates than the state. It has currently been extended to October the 16th, and that is obviously, depending on how this plays out, could be rescinded earlier if we see that is an option, but obviously it's in place until October 16th right now because of everything that we're seeing. And then finally, the President Trump, on the national level, declared a national emergency on COVID-19 the day after, on March 13th. So in 3 days, both the municipality, the state, and the national government all declared national emergencies. And I will say that the federal declaration is really the key one, because that is what's opened up a lot of the additional federal funding that has come through into both the state and Anchorage, mainly a lot of the FEMA funding. This is really what has opened up that. So this is why we're here, the public health emergency around COVID-19. And we wanted to talk a little bit. I know we've talked a lot about how COVID-19 has impacted the homeless community and our shelter community around town. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of going over that. And as you can see, I think one of the big takeaways from this is that last winter, pre-COVID, we had almost 700 shelter beds throughout Anchorage at a number of different facilities. And as a result of a lot of the CDC guidance and other health guidance that has been issued since the pandemic started, mainly around 6 feet of physical distancing, screening, and things like that, we saw a net loss of almost 400 beds as a result of that around town. And you can see we went from 688 to about 290 as a result. So how are some of those decisions made? Obviously, as I was mentioning, in meal service areas, the CDC recommendations for shelter facilities is that you need space, 6 feet of space between seats when you're serving meals. And in general sleeping areas, specifically where there is no one experiencing respiratory symptoms, it is recommended that clients' faces are at least 6 feet apart and that the beds or mats of the clients sleep head to toe. So obviously, in our current, or I guess pre-COVID last winter and previous to that kind of shelter situation, that was just not possible. We were overcrowded in many of our shelters around town, and it just wasn't a safe COVID environment to continue that. So what did the municipality do in response to that? Well, what we did is we clearly and quickly started looking at facilities that we could stand up quickly as emergency shelter. And I think as many people know and have heard, we stood up within about a week of declaring the public health emergency, both the Ben Boeke and the Sullivan Arena. And we chose both of those sites as a temporary emergency shelter for a couple of different reasons. One, we knew we needed to move quickly to provide some emergency shelter and the necessary spacing. And it was also, since the municipality owns both of these facilities, these were easier for the municipality to stand up and begin emergency sheltering. But I think one of the things that drove the decision of why we wanted to do that is we really wanted to protect the vulnerable in our community, and that's really what we did. And at its peak, both the Boeke and the Sullivan had a capacity of about 480. We had a peak of 377 on March 29th, and then just on a random April day, we had about 325. So we knew that going into the summer months that we weren't necessarily going to need a capacity of 480. So we have been able to decommission and return the Ben Boeke to its normal use, which is a hockey arena, and we are now just using the Sullivan Arena as the emergency shelter, which allows a capacity of 350. But I will say that over the last month or so, because of the amount of rain that we've received and other things, there have been a few times where we have reached capacity, and as we'll discuss throughout the evening, this is not a long-term solution. Clearly, as the winter approaches and the weather starts getting colder, additional capacity is going to be needed, and that's one of the reasons why we have introduced AO 2020-66. So wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the different federal stimulus that has been out there. Currently, we have gone through about 3.5 phases. Congress is currently debating phase 4 and what that would incorporate, but running through them, phase 1 was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. It was compared to the ones that are coming, a relatively low dollar amount in terms of federal aid, and it was Mainly, it was about $8 billion, a little over $8 billion, but the vast majority of that was dedicated to researching COVID-19 and working on a vaccine. The second phase that came very quickly after was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and it was about $100 billion, so it was substantially more than the first phase, and it provided paid sick leave and tax credits, some free COVID testing, and expanding food assistance and unemployment benefits, and also increasing Medicaid funding as well. But it became very clear very quickly after this that this also wasn't going to be enough. So we quickly moved into phase 3, which is the CARES Act. And I think this is the one that the vast majority of people in the community have heard about, or at least have a basic understanding of what it is. And it is the largest peacetime stimulus measure that the United States has ever passed. Phase 3 of the CARES Act was about $2.2 trillion, and it was meant to provide support to the economy, public health, state and local governments, individuals, and businesses. And we'll run through a couple of those, but I will, as I move on, I want people to remember that, you know, $2.2 trillion and phase 3.5, which was just essentially an add-on to the CARES, was another $500 billion or so. So really the CARES Act was about a $2.7 to $2.8 trillion stimulus package. And again, this was the largest peacetime stimulus package in our history. So what did the CARES Act include? It included, as many businesses around Anchorage, the state, and the country are likely very well aware, it provided initially $350 billion into the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, that many folks have heard about and have likely taken advantage of over the last couple of months. It included some direct lending to passenger and cargo air carriers, as well as a large amount for businesses that were determined by the federal government to be important to the national security. And the remaining 500 or 450 billion of this fund was given to the Department of Treasury for direct lending to distressed businesses. So not only was there the PPP, but there was also this direct lending from the Department of Treasury. And then the two others that folks probably are most familiar with are, it provided an additional $600 per week in unemployment assistance. That just expired last week, and currently, obviously, many folks, and we'll talk about this in a minute, Congress is currently debating what that should look like and what dollar amount, and there is obviously some disagreement on what that should look like. But for the last 13 weeks, folks that have been on unemployment insurance have received an additional $600 per week from the federal government. And then the final one was the direct stimulus payment from the federal government in the amount of $1,200 for those that had an adjusted gross income of $75,000 or $150,000 if you filed jointly with a spouse or a partner. And there was also an additional rebate of $500 per child that was given to individuals. But as I mentioned, the PPP program was extremely popular, and the money went very quickly in that program. So Congress, about a month later, passed, what we consider phase 3.5, an addendum to the CARES Act of almost an additional $500 billion, $320 billion, which was put back into the PPP program, and you can see $60 billion of it was set aside for small lenders and community financial institutions, and then another $75 billion for hospitals and more for the economic injury disaster loan, another $50 billion there as well. So we've talked about that they're currently discussing phase 4. There are two competing proposals that are being discussed right now. The first is the HEROES Act. This is a proposal that has passed the House of Representatives. It is a $3 trillion stimulus package that mirrors a lot of the things that were in the original CARES Act. It provides an additional $1 trillion to state and local governments to respond to the impacts of COVID on both the state and community level. It again provides another $1,200 direct stimulus, up to $6,000 per household of direct stimulus for individuals. It also extends the federal unemployment payments at $600 through January of 2021. For an additional about 6 months, folks could expect to receive $600 in unemployment insurance. It provides $175 billion in new support for those that need assistance in rental or home mortgage payments or utility payments. And that's the HEROES Act. The HEALS Act was just introduced late last week. This has been introduced by the administration and Senate Republicans in the United States Senate. It is about a $1 trillion stimulus. There are a lot of different aspects of this. I will just touch on a couple of those as well, mainly the ones that are similar. There is a $1,200 as well direct stimulus payment, an additional one for individuals that make up to a certain threshold. I believe that number is still $75,000 or $150,000 if you file jointly. On the unemployment benefits, that number is a little bit lower. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of about $200 to $400 in terms of additional payment that would last, I believe, again through January of 2021 as well. So we are fully expecting that over the next couple of weeks, Congress and the administration in DC will continue to negotiate and likely come up with some sort of package that everyone can agree on, and it can pass both houses of Congress and ultimately be signed by the president. They are shooting for sometime over the next week or 10 days so that they can go back home to their states and their districts to for their normal, what we would consider their August recess that they spend back in their states. So there's obviously more to come, and we fully expect that there will be additional stimulus that is coming from DC in the coming days. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is one aspect of the CARES Act, and it's the one that we have received our $156 million from. But what was it? Well, it was $150 billion that was provided to all the states, tribal governments, and local governments around the country. Every state received no less than $1.25 billion. And because this was based on population, Alaska received that amount. They received $1.25 billion. As a result of getting this through the legislature and the governor, the municipality will receive a little over $156 million. Our first payment that we have received, we do have it in our account, was in the amount of $116 million. There are two additional payments that will come our way in the same amount, just under $20 million, but to be eligible to receive those payments, we have to spend 80% of the prior payment. So to be eligible to receive the second payment of roughly $20 million, we have to have spent roughly $93 million before we can go back to the state and say, we have now spent the right percentage, and we would like you to now send us the next $20 million, and then we would have to go through the same process of spending roughly $16 million of that payment before we could then go back to the state and ask for the final third payment. One thing to understand about the CARES Act as it's currently written is all of these funds have to be spent by December 30th of 2020, or they have to be returned to the federal government. So that is one piece just to keep in mind as we go through this. But I do want to spend a little time also kind of going through what both the administration and the assembly have already done with some of the CARES Act or the coronavirus relief fund that we have received. We have already appropriated, authorized, and starting to put out onto the street $6 million for small businesses and nonprofits. We've already put out $3 million in rental and mortgage assistance, and that is currently on the street and being accessed. And we will certainly continue to push out information on both of these for the rental and mortgage assistance. Anyone that is on the line that believes they need help in any of these areas should call 211, and they will assist you and walk you through the process to potentially be eligible to receive rental and mortgage assistance. We have put $10 million into a licensed child care relief fund. Those applications and that is now out on the street, and child care facilities are applying for this money as well. We have approved a public lands jobs program of $3 million to put those that have been furloughed or seen their hours reduced at other jobs to be able to hire people to help us remove high fire danger spruce beetle killed trees around the municipality, as well as helping us put additional work into some of our trails and parks around the municipality. We've also set aside $1.5 million in a contingency fund to help us more rapidly respond to issues that come up. So we've already approved to date about $23.5 million. And I will say that I don't have a slide, but I believe that all of this is public as part of the Assembly agenda. But on Tuesday night, we will be discussing a much larger package on the CARES Act that will include additional funding into a lot of these different areas, among others, to start getting a lot more of this coronavirus relief fund money into the community. And I will also say that the one other aspect of this as well is I know the Assembly just set a special meeting for Friday at I believe 1:30 to authorize $7 million in additional small business grants to the tourism and hospitality industry. So there is a lot of money that will be flowing into these different areas here in the very near future. But I just wanted to run through those so people understand that a lot of this money is going to start getting into the community relatively quickly. So I want to talk a little bit about the planning and what has led us to AO 2020-66. I think one of the things where I want to start with is back in May of 2018, the Assembly passed an ordinance that said we really want to see dispersed placement of services and programs for homeless persons outside of the core downtown area where they have been for decades. And this is a key piece of why we looked at the properties that we did and why we ultimately selected the properties that we did, is we were following some of the guidance that has been given to us from the legislative body. But that certainly is not the only place that has informed some of these decisions. I think a lot of people have heard us talking about our anchored home plan, the plan that has been developed in coordination with the municipality, the Coalition to End Homelessness, among others. Its vision, its overarching vision, is to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time. And it also identifies some concrete actions that we can take to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time. But really, the four key pillars that we will talk about over the next couple of slides are about prevention and diversion, housing and support, public health and safety, and then obviously advocacy and funding. So every single year, as a result of the Anchored Home Plan, the coalition, among others, put out priorities on what we should look at for the coming year. And the Anchored Home 2020 priorities was released. It was made public in November of 2019 and has been available for viewing and comment for quite a while. But it clearly lines up with a number of the things that we are trying to do as a result of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And a couple of them that are the top priorities are increasing day shelter options, increasing overnight shelter, and identify 150 overflow beds, and also housing individuals in supportive housing, and also housing additional individuals in rapid rehousing. And that is really a couple of the core pieces of AO 2020-66. But that obviously is only one piece of the work that both the community and the coalition do. Over the last couple of months, the coalition with a number of other partners have worked on what we have called a gap analysis and coming up with 2021 community priorities. And what they have identified is that there is a significant lack of rapid rehousing for vulnerable adults, and that there's a significant lack of permanent supportive housing. And we need to ensure, as a matter of public health and safety, that there is sufficient shelter capacity, especially during the wintertime. And as we'll see, some of the recommendations, at least the highest priority recommendations that they made, also very much line up with what we are trying to do with AO 2020-66. And that is to say, we're going to be providing more supportive housing. We're going to be providing additional shelter capacity, and that the shelter capacity that we provide needs to have both day and night services, and that is something that we definitely want to include and are proposing in AO 2020-66. We want to provide the resources and referral services, and certainly we've had a lot of success over the last couple of months at the Sullivan and the Bunboki, setting up our resource hub and bringing, really for the first time, a lot of the providers directly to the individuals that are experiencing homelessness. And just over the last April to June timeframe, we were able to house almost 200 individuals that were experiencing homelessness. And in the normal kind of time frame over that time in 2019 and years prior, we were closer to only 100 or 120. So we saw a significant uptick when we were able to actually bring the resource and referral services directly to the location of the shelter where folks were staying. And then the next part is certainly being able to ensure sustained funding both from the local level, but also the state government. And that has certainly been one of the things that we have heard from a number of state representatives, that they are committed to helping the municipality, not probably just Anchorage, but many of the local governments around the state in dealing with this issue. This is something that they should help the local governments with. And every single year we put together a legislative program that is proposed by the administration and approved by the Assembly. And I certainly anticipate that in January of next year, part of the top priority that we will have as a municipality is for funding from the state government to help us deal with some of these issues. And then the final top priority that the coalition came up with in their gap analysis was providing additional rapid rehousing. So all of that really helped us inform what we wanted to do and what the properties look like that are in 2020-66. But again, we'll run through this really quickly. What is AO 2020-66? It's obviously an ordinance to purchased 4 properties, both for the acquisition and renovation. It's not to exceed $22.5 million. It's co-sponsored by Assembly Chair Rivera as well as Assembly members Zalatil and Constant. But what, at its core, would it do? It would allow us to open up a treatment center to help people with substance misuse. It would provide additional bridge or rapid rehousing and permanent supportive living spaces. It would provide daytime engagement centers and social services for people experiencing homelessness, and it would also allow for an overnight shelter space for those experiencing homelessness. So one of the things that, before we get into too many of the other details, I know one of the things that many individuals have asked us about is how can we spend $12.5 million of this $22.5 that we are requesting with the CARES Act, and is that an eligible expense? And basically, the Treasury Department has put out multiple different levels of guidance. This first guidance document, it obviously was updated on June 30th, but it came out much sooner than that. Essentially, it's a 3-pronged test, and you have to ask: are the expenditures necessary and incurred due to the public health emergency? In our opinion, and in the opinion of many, that answer is obviously yes. We are incurring a lot of the expenses operating the Boki, the Sullivan, and dealing with this as a direct result of the COVID pandemic and the reduction in the number of beds that we have in our current shelter capacity. None of these costs were accounted for in any of our previous or our most recently passed budget that was our first quarter budget that was approved. None of these were accounted, so that obviously passes muster on this one. And the costs have been incurred between March 1st, 2020 and December 30th. And we are certainly incurring those costs during that time frame. Going a little bit deeper into the guidance, they do provide a non-exclusive list of or examples of eligible expenditures. And although these are not the only ones that are eligible, they do say that expenses of actions to facilitate compliance with COVID-19 related public health measures, such as expenses for care for homeless populations provided to mitigate COVID-19 effects and enable compliance with COVID-19 public health precautions. And certainly that is what we are doing. We are dealing and trying to mitigate the COVID-19 effects and working to comply with all of the different public health precautions that have been instituted. We've also had our municipal attorney, Kate Vogel, do a lot of research into this, and essentially the short answer is that the use of CARES Act funds is legally appropriate because it is consistent with the federal statute and in line with official guidance from the United States Treasury Department and CDC recommendations. I will also just add that we are not the only community in the country that are exploring and using the CARES Act funding for these purposes. There are a number of communities that have already purchased different buildings to handle the impacts that COVID-19 has put on their homeless community and in their individual community. So certainly, in our view, this is something that both the Congress and the Department of Treasury clearly identified as an area that was eligible and thought that local governments as well as potentially states would likely spend some of their federal funding that they received on. So going in, let's dive into some of the different properties and what they look like. We're going to start with the Golden Lion. This is the property that is proposed to be the treatment center. I'm going to start going back a little ways, which is to say that this idea about creating an additional treatment center has been discussed for at least the last 5 years since this administration and this mayor were elected back in 2015 as an actual need in the community. And as a result of the sale of Municipal Light and Power, ML&P, to Chugach Electric, one of the aspects that was in the stipulated agreement that was ultimately conditionally approved by the RCA was that the MOA was required to spend $15 million to build or construct a new Alaska Center for Treatment that would be constructed on the Municipality of Anchorage land, owned by the municipality, and ultimately operated by a third-party operator. And everyone agreed that this is a critical void in the services in Anchorage that impacts all of the residents of the municipality. So certainly, this is where we would be spending the money to purchase the treatment center. The treatment center will have no money coming from the CARES Act. It would come from this pot of money once the ML&P transaction is officially closed and has been transferred over to Chugach Electric. So coming back to the Best Western, the Golden Lion, we wanted to provide what we see is some of the what the total operating expenses look like based on everything that we know right now. Certainly, as we go in and talk about some of the questions here in a little while, we're going to talk a little bit more about the RFP process and how that's going to ultimately really inform and tell us what the ultimate budget is going to be. But certainly, looking at the first couple of years to be able to operate this treatment center, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 to $2.5 million over the first couple of years. Now, certainly, how are we paying for that? Well, as we have discussed, we fully believe that Medicaid through the new 1115 waiver that has been given to the state will certainly be able to reimburse a number of these costs. Private insurance will obviously also potentially provide some of the costs, and then as we have talked about, there will be some step-down housing for those that have successfully completed the treatment program, so that they still have a place to be until they figure out where their long-term housing will be. So where does that leave us? Over the first couple of years, that means that about 1.5 or 1.2 to 1.8 million will need to be covered either through some sort of municipal funding or through philanthropy, or as I mentioned earlier, potentially if we're successful in getting state funding. And we certainly anticipate that as part of the RFP process, one of the aspects around there is, or one of the ways that we are going to grade this and score the RFP and ultimately selecting an operator is the operator that can show us how they can make this number much lower and ultimately self-sustaining through Medicaid and other insurance repayment options. I do want to just highlight that there are a number of existing inpatient treatment centers around town. We have 7, those are the orange squares. Many of them are in neighborhoods or very close to neighborhoods in and around town, and have been very good neighbors and cause very little community disturbance once folks are there. And we fully anticipate that this one will be no different than the other inpatient treatment centers that we have in the community right now. The America's Best Value Inn and Suites. This is the one that we anticipate using for transition or rapid rehousing and some permanent supportive housing. What does this look like? Again, for kind of a first 3-year pro forma budget with total operating expenses as well as other program expenses. And again, somewhere in the neighborhood of just under $3 million to operate this facility over the first couple of years. Again, where does the money come from to operate this facility? And again, We certainly believe that as a result of the new Medicaid 1115 waiver, that there are activities that will be, or services that will be given at this facility that will be reimbursable through Medicaid. A significant portion of this will be, or a significant amount of the revenue come from housing vouchers and subsidy support. But again, we come back to there is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $1.5 million to $2 million in funding that the municipality will need to find either through funding ourselves or through state or philanthropic support. And we'll talk about some of those areas here in a little bit as well. And then the final two are the former Alaska Club and the Beans Cafe building. And both of those, we are looking at the former Alaska Club would be an overnight shelter, but also a daytime engagement center as well. And the Beans Cafe building would be used as a daytime engagement center to service and provide those services to those individuals that are currently staying at the Brother Francis shelter. And as you can see, again, pro forma operating costs for all three of these new services that would be provided, the additional overnight and the two daytime engagement centers, we're estimating it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about $3.5 million to be able to operate each of these facilities successfully. And this one is more, there isn't a ton of either housing vouchers or others that will support this. We are hearing that as a result, I'll come back to it again, the 1115 Medicaid waiver, that there is the potential that some of this could be reimbursed that way. I believe there is at least one shelter in town that is pursuing that, and we will obviously certainly look to them for how successful they are, but certainly philanthropic and municipal support will be needed to provide the funding for this. So what are the operating needs when you look at all of these together? The treatment center in year one, it looks about $1.8 million, a little bit over. The America's Best Value, it's just under $2 million. And then the Alaska Club and Day Engagement Centers are needed about $3.5 million for a total of just over $7 million, or about $7.3 million to be able to operate these facilities. So where does the funding come from to pay for the operations of each of these? I think as people have heard through public testimony, we have a commitment from the Rasmussen Foundation in the amount of $3.5 million to fund the daytime engagement centers over the next couple of years. Certainly they have indicated that they are willing to work with us in terms of how that money is spread out over the next couple of years so that we can lower the amount that either the municipality is required to pay out in the early years, or as we'll see in the next two potential options, allow us to use the federal funding that we have gotten that have more time constraints on them. Which the first one, again, the CARES Act, as we discussed, was a very large stimulus bill that had many different components in it. One of them was grants for emergency solutions. It's the Emergency Solutions Grant. The municipality has been able to receive to date almost $2.8 million in this grant funding. This funding can be used for providing funding for shelter or day engagement centers, and it also has a 2-year time commitment. So we have to have spent this within the next 2 years, or we lose this funding. Another one was the Community Development Block Grant. We've received almost $1.7 million. Again, this one can be used for some of the very similar areas around this Emergency Solutions Grant, and again have about a 2-year window for us to be able to spend those dollars. So again, each of these will work together with the Rasmussen Foundation and some of these other funding options to ensure that we are using the dollars that we need to spend first, and we don't lose them. Certainly the other area that we have talked about for a couple of years now that was approved by voters was the alcohol tax. We believe that over the 2021 that about $12 million thereabout will come in funding for the alcohol tax. So about $3.5 million would be set aside to fund either the ongoing costs of the treatment center or some other homelessness related areas. Certainly there is already some money in our budget for shelter capacity. Last year the Assembly passed for about 9 months out of the year, $735,000. So if you expand this to a full year, that's about $1 million that will already be in our budget for shelter capacity that we can use towards funding these. The other that we've spent a lot of time talking about is the MOA trust. This is something that was set up about 25, 30 years ago when the municipality last sold a utility, and they put all of the proceeds from that into our own local permanent fund that every single year pays out about 4.25%, and allows us to spend that money on priorities throughout the municipality. This last year, as a result of the ML&P sale, we'll see a huge increase to the amount that is in the trust fund. We anticipate when the sale closes, putting almost $230 million into the trust, which would more than double the trust. We believe that this year we have already accounted for the trust payment in the amount of about $13 million for this year's budget. Next year's budget, we anticipate seeing an increase to that payout of about $3.6 million that could be used to go to funding some of these facilities. Certainly, we have heard from a number of other philanthropic organizations around town that they are very interested in helping provide some funding. But they just want to see what it ultimately looks like before committing. But we certainly expect that there will be others that over the course of the next 6 months will step forward and provide funding for these facilities if we're successful in getting Assembly passage. And then, as I mentioned, we certainly expect and hope that the state of Alaska will contribute a portion of the funding for the operational costs of these facilities. So when you add up all of these and taking into account that we still expect more philanthropic contributions and hopefully see something from the state of Alaska, just next year we're looking at almost $16 million in funding that is available to fund these. But as I mentioned, we're going to work to make sure that these different blocks of funding are used most appropriately. So certainly next year, I think there will not need to be potentially as much from the trust to pay for this or the alcohol tax, because we already have money from the Community Development Block Grant, the Emergency Solutions, and some contributions from Rasmussen already. But certainly we will make kind of all of these work together to ensure that stable funding is there year over year. So wanted to run through a couple of questions that we have received. What are the costs of renovations for each of these facilities? The America's Best Value, we have estimated there's about $500,000 in renovations that we need to do. A lot of this covers efficiency conversions. We need to add some kitchenettes to some of the units, security cameras, intercoms, and some fencing. The Golden Lion, we've estimated about $1 million, roughly the same type of stuff that's in the America's Best Value, security cameras, kitchenettes, some furnishing, fixtures, and equipment. And then for the Alaska Club, this will be the most extensive one that requires renovations, mainly because we'll have to add an elevator. we'll sprinkler the entire thing. We'll do some bathroom renovations and obviously add some laundry and new HVAC and also repair the roof as well. You know, I think a question that we constantly get is, why am I just hearing about this? I will say that we have not done anything different in terms of the public process for any other ordinance. This is the same process that we handle any other property acquisition ordinance. It was introduced on June 23rd, and obviously public testimony began on July 14th. And there has been a number of different forums that folks from the administration, the assembly, as well as outside partners have participated in over the last month. And just want to point out that the municipal code governs how real estate is acquired, and certainly Robin Ward will be available to answer any more detailed questions about why the real property does not need to be put out to competitive bid or an RFP when we're talking about those. And I will just add that at no point has the mayor or this administration used any of its emergency powers in this process. This has gone through the normal process. Not one emergency power has been used in moving this ordinance forward. What are the expected operating costs? I'll run through a couple of these since these were some of the last slides. We've already kind of talked about this, about the 7.3 million we're expecting in annual operating costs, at least for next year. And certainly with the treatment center, we certainly expect that whoever the ultimate provider is, that number will ultimately get to zero, and this building will become self-sustaining through other operating or other funding mechanisms. What are the expected operating costs and how will the MOA fund them? Again, just ran through all of these, so I'll skip over this relatively quickly. How else is the MOA going to use CARES Act funding to help businesses and residents? Again, I'll just run through kind of what we've already done. And certainly there is a much larger package that will be before the assembly on Tuesday that both the assembly and the administration have worked very collaboratively on to target where a lot of this money is most needed. So certainly I would tune in to Tuesday night and participate in the public hearing. How are these properties selected and were others considered? Certainly we can run through this and Robin Ward can discuss in more detail, but essentially she led this effort along with a number of other internal experts from our health department, the planning department, the building safety department, to kind of look at all of the different properties around town. I will point us back to the fact that a couple of years ago, the assembly directed or set a policy that we should look outside of the downtown area. That is what we did. We started with a list of every hotel property in the Anchorage Bowl, plus other residential and non-residential properties. We created a criteria that was based on some of the criteria or the best ideas on what type of facilities are needed for each of these, or the best practices that have been developed in other communities to provide these types of services at different facilities. And we ultimately narrowed the list down from every single hotel or other property down to a much more manageable list. We then reached out to a number of those, either directly to the owner or one of the agents that might be representing them through the sale process. And for a variety of reasons, we excluded any of those that had a value of over $20 million, or through that process, there were a number of them that said they were not interested in selling because they had long-term lease commitments or franchise commitments, or the price that they sent back to us that they were wanting was simply too high. So there was a very detailed process that we went through, and Robin will be available to potentially answer any additional questions that people might have on that as well. So another question that we receive a lot is, why are we buying these buildings before we will know who operates them? And I think, as I've said a number of times at a number of different forums, is that a lot of this has been informed by past practice. And we most recently put out an RFI to find additional shelter capacity at the beginning of this year. And we didn't receive any proposals for that, which really surprised us. And we sat down with a number of the organizations, and obviously the top three reasons that they gave us were they weren't interested in doing anything additional in the downtown area. That was very clear. They wanted the municipality to also address bridge or permanent supportive housing along with additional treatment options. And I think the biggest one that we heard from them was while there is significant interest in providing these types of services in our town, there was not a lot of interest to provide or go through kind of the RFP or RFI process without knowing the exact location where these services would be provided. So that is what ultimately informed our decision to buy these properties and then go through the RFP process to find the operator. Again, a question is, on the treatment side, how many spaces are currently available in existing facilities? And as you can see, just over the last 8 years, we've lost over 20 treatment bed in our capacity, even though some of the issues that we're dealing with on alcohol and drugs and other issues has only increased. And currently the wait times for treatment at a lot of these facilities is anywhere from 14 to 85 days, which for those that have needed treatment or gone through treatment, you know, from our perspective, just isn't acceptable. If you're in need of treatment, you need to have that treatment available today, not 14 or 85 days from now. Again, another question is, how can we use Karzak funding for the acquisition? I think I spent a lot of time earlier in the presentation about that. And then, when will these facilities be operational? And again, I think some of this is going to be different for each of the facilities. You know, we'll have to go through pending assembly approval, negotiating with the owners on an agreeable price, doing a remaining due diligence. We'll have to go through the RFP process to find an operator provider for each of these facilities. So best case, going through that entire process, we're looking at the end of this year for a couple of these facilities, but more likely sometime in 2021 for a number of the other facilities. How will you ensure safe transportation to and from the facilities? As I mentioned, the RFP process, we fully expect a number of different areas that we will include in the RFP that we will grade or provide or set the scoring sheet on. And I will just mention that a lot of this has been informed over the last 6 weeks as we have talked to the community, and they have provided input through testimony and emails and phone calls about what they would like to see in the RFP. But certainly, as it relates to transportation, one of the things that we will include on the RFP is who are your partners? What are your partner services? And what that entails is who's going to help you provide indoor, outdoor recreation and ultimately transportation services to and from some of these different facilities that they might ultimately need to go to. So this will certainly be a part of the RFP process. And how will you mitigate impacts to neighborhoods and businesses? Again, within the RFP, we fully expect to have a large portion of the scoring dedicated to those people that can best show that they have a neighborhood impact mitigation plan that includes both safety and security protocols and demonstrates a clear understanding and strategies to minimize any negative community impact. So that will certainly be part of the process. And finally is, how can we incorporate the community feedback during the RFP process? again, I think this process is going to take quite a while. If we are successful in getting Assembly approval for this, the administration will need to go through and start writing and developing the RFP. This is a public document. It is posted on the municipal website in the purchasing department's site. So anyone can go in there and read it and see what we are asking of the proposals or the proposers, and how we are ultimately going to score each of the proposals that we receive. Ultimately, once that happens, the administration will be responsible for selecting the most qualified and negotiating a contract with them. And at that point, that is really when the public gets to have more input into that process, because the contracts ultimately need to be approved by the Assembly. And certainly we expect, and I believe the Assembly has already said, that once we get to this point, they will likely schedule public work sessions to review the terms of the contract and make sure that what we have said we wanted to see in the RFP is actually coming through in the contract. And finally, a vote from the Assembly will be required before we can actually enter into the contract and move forward with operating any of these different facilities. So with that, we have reached the end of my presentation, and I think I might call an audible and ask if Carolyn wants to ask some of the questions that have come through, since I have not kept up to speed with them, and she can assign them potentially while I catch up to individuals.
Sure, Jason. Thank you very much. The first question is from Kevin, and he says, what is the advantage of locating the services in Midtown as opposed to providing them nearer to downtown, where the homeless tend to congregate now? Is the purpose to simply disperse them around the city? I don't know if that's a good question potentially for you, Jason, or Nancy Burke, perhaps.
I'll take the first crack at it, and I'll say that I think one of the things that we have learned over the years, and what ultimately led to the Assembly passing the resolution that they did, which was to say we need to have more of these facilities, not just within one area of town, because we have seen what that results in, and that is an overcrowded shelter system in one very distinct part of town that just isn't and hasn't been sustainable. So ultimately, we wanted to find facilities that would offer the type of services that we were ultimately looking for and what we've identified, and say we're going to better be able to handle smaller shelters, smaller facilities that don't necessarily have 500 people in them in only one part of town. And I think that is something that many other communities across the United States have been very successful at in terms of trying to deal with some of the homeless population around their communities as well.
Great. The next question may be for Chris Schutte. It was posted by someone anonymously, and it says the rezoning ordinance has been tabled for the time being. How can you go ahead and try to purchase these buildings without having the proper zoning in place? To me, this sounds like the Assembly and Ethan will do what they want once they get the buildings, in hopes that public concern dies down. Chris, is that something you're able to handle?
Happy to do it, Carolyn. Thank you. The question about the B3 zoning ordinance and the purchase of these properties is only loosely related. So the B3 ordinance, as it relates to homeless and transient shelters, only applies in the case where there is a B3 zoned property where overnight shelter of homeless and transient individuals is proposed. Of the properties that are proposed for acquisition, one is for a treatment facility, one is for general social services, the daytime engagement center, and then one is for what's known as habilitative care, or sort of a living situation that's not a transient shelter, but is an assisted residential facility where the residents will be receiving additional social services and not just simply shelter. Additionally, it's not a transient facility, so they would not be able to walk up. So for 3 of the 4 purchases, the B3 zoning ordinance does not apply. For the Tudor Alaska Club property, the initial proposed use is as a daytime engagement center. And again, the B3 zoning ordinance is not needed for that function. The daytime engagement center is an allowable use as of today in that location. However, at some point, as that facility transitions into overnight shelter, overnight transient homeless shelter, that does require a change to the B3 zoning district and the Title 21 rules around transient and homeless shelters. The original B3 ordinance has been postponed indefinitely because the Assembly, the public, and the administration are working on a much more deliberative process to modify Title 21 to accommodate the B3 zoning for homeless and transient shelters. So the Assembly kicked this off several weeks ago at their Community and Economic Development Committee meeting. In fact, I believe they have a meeting on this very topic tomorrow morning. And that process will take the traditional route of Title 21 amendments, which is a lengthy public process followed by Planning and Zoning Commission review and approval before it goes back to the Assembly for their final adoption. So to summarize, 3 of the 4 properties do not require any B3 zoning changes, and only one of the properties will require it at some point in the future.
Great. Jason, do you want me to?
Thanks, Chris. I'll jump in with the next question as I've caught up to a couple of them. The next one I think might be for Jasmine, and it is from Leon James, and it is the coalition mentions core values of dignity, respect, equity, and compassion. Could someone speak to how that intersects with trauma-informed care?
Thank you for the question. Can you folks hear me? So this is Jasmine. I work with the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, which is a group of providers, partners, folks from the healthcare industry, the school district, our corrections agencies around town to come together to address homelessness. So when we talk about our core values and how they intersect with trauma-informed care, that's really where we take the mission work into different services and look at how clients are being worked with, how they're being represented, how they're being treated. That looks different depending on different types of services. We hear the phrase trauma-informed care most frequently when we talk about people that are living through significant trauma and very, very much high acuity individuals with significant needs. And that's a special type of training for folks that don't know that help empower the workforce to work with people who are living through mental health challenges and trauma. So that is a core value. I would liken that to our core value of respect. That part of how we respect the stories, the lives, and the individuals that we are caring for in some of these higher end services is by doing that with a model that recognizes that many of these individuals have been traumatized by, in the case of our youth, by issues of child abuse, in the case of many of our domestic violence survivors, by former partners, certainly for our victims of human trafficking, our combat veterans. A lot of our folks, again, in those high acuity programs, they really need additional services to help them process that trauma and get them back on their feet.
And Jasmine, I'm going to leave you up there because the next question that come in is the latest. It's anonymous. The latest CDC guidance states that homeless shelters should try to ensure the client's faces are 6 feet apart. Given that guidance, wouldn't the city estimate for available shelter beds be much higher if those guidelines were instituted?
Thanks for that question. It's great to hear that people are looking through the CDC guidance. This is actually the first step that we took to address COVID. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with the city, the health department, and the Emergency Operations Center when COVID first came to Alaska, and we knew that it would likely hit Anchorage first. Previously in Alaska, we were following the state of Alaska guidelines, which suggested that best practice in an infectious disease episode is 3 feet of space between people sleeping in shelters. Very quickly, we heard that guidance that it was 6 feet, and that's actually why the Ben Boeke Arena, the Sullivan Arena, and the Dempsey Arenas were turned into temporary homeless shelters, was very specifically because we reduced capacity at all 8 of our other shelters in order to make sure that there was 6 feet of sleeping space. Most of our shelters in town have continued to keep that lower capacity. So if you check out the city has a dashboard, and likely Nancy or Jason could tell you how to navigate there, but they have a dashboard that has nightly shelter capacity. That has been adjusted for the fact that we are practicing that 6 feet of spacing in all of our shelters in Anchorage. And we have been, I believe, since early March. But again, someone can fact check me on that. It's been several months.
Thanks, Jasmine. The next question I'm going to ask Robin to answer, which is, when did we begin the property selection process for the properties named in AO 2020-66?
Hi, this is Robin. The Alaska Club has been under evaluation for close to 1 year. We have more information on that. We've had more of our private contractors tour that and give us information on the condition of the property itself. The hotels have been probably the last 5 months. We started with the initial list 4 to 5 months ago and have been working that list. The Beans Cafe has been probably the last 3 to 4 months. So on different time frames, but about 4.5 months ago is when we started with the initial list of 40 hotels all over town with 80 rooms or more.
Thank you, Robin. Carolyn, have you caught up to a couple of more questions? Can you, while I catch up to some more? You're on mute, Carolyn.
I was waiting for my computer to catch up there. Sorry about that, everybody. This next question is from Kirk, and it's for Robin actually. Kirk asks, who has given you the numbers for the renovations? So my understanding of the question is that it would be about how much will it cost for the renovations, and how did you develop those numbers?
These are general estimates. They're as close as we could estimate without doing full due diligence in environmental issues, in it's like asbestos, in entire building condition analysis. We had our building department help us. We also had the planning department, and we had several private contractors who were well experienced in redeveloping older buildings into permanent supported housing. So these, again, are only general estimates. We tried to find a range. It was fairly close, but part of our work after approval of acquisition will be to complete the due diligence and actually bring architects and engineers and contractors through to create those full estimates.
Thanks, Robin. The next question, Jasmine, I might have you answer this this question as it relates to something that you just completed with the gap analysis, which is, does the Muni have an accurate count of the number of homeless beds that are needed in our community?
Yes. Well, if you're using ours, yes. I don't know if the municipality has done that, but the coalition through our membership just completed our first annual gap analysis. For folks that are interested, it really looks at supply. What do we have in town for homeless services, and demand? And that demand is based on some new data work that we did through Anchored Home in 2018 and 2019. So we use demand projections for 2018 and 2019. That slide, I think earlier, that was shared by Jason shows that currently, and this is pre-COVID, we needed 3,000 units to meet or 3,000 beds to meet current demand. And that's not perfect math. I do want to be clear about that. For example, if we ramped up prevention, we wouldn't need as many beds on the high end side of things because we would have caught people before they became homeless. So there's a bit of a give and a take with that 3,000 number. I think what's important to understand is we did not know the economic impacts of COVID and did not have as much insight as we do now. So I think a question I hear a lot is, how does this relate to homelessness and COVID? And I'll be clear, from the coalition's perspective, we needed roughly 3,000 units, and that's across the spectrum. Some of that is shelter, some of that is actual housing. We needed those units before COVID. I think what we're seeing, and for those that were able to tune into AEDC's economic projections, AEDC is projecting that 11,000 jobs will be lost in Anchorage. And when I compare that to the reality that we have about 20,000 households that are rent burdened, meaning that they're paying between 30 to 50% or more of their monthly income on their rent, and the reality that the $600 of extra unemployment is ending, the eviction moratorium is ending, my concerns representing the coalition are not about the 3,000 or so beds that we needed prior to COVID, but it's about new homelessness. I think that we have a common understanding in the public that homelessness is the person who's outside, maybe inebriated, living in a camp. And according to the police department, that's only about 250 people. Our system served 8,000 people last year. And you only saw, again, according to the police department, you only saw about 250 of them outside in the height of summer. So I'm actually more focused on the 7,000 people that we were able to connect to services, and the reality that the people who are coming at us with new homelessness from COVID are likely to be our neighbors. They're likely to be people that were working jobs that no longer have those jobs, are falling behind on rent that they never expected to fall behind on. So I am afraid, and national experts and certainly our local partners in real estate, our tenancy advocates, the 211 data that we're getting, what's that indicating to us is that people are calling and saying, do we pay rent or do we pay for food? And we are entering into a situation that we are going to have continued job loss. We're going to have continued economic impacts. So I am most concerned about new homelessness. And new homelessness is going to unfortunately look very different than the homelessness that we're seeing right now. I personally, on behalf of the coalition, believe that is the urgency. And I think a simple data point, and I'll wind down with this, is in talking with 211, who provides some of those first level services to people in need, they got calls in June that equaled the volume of the entirety of 2019. And it was, again, that same story of people calling and saying, do I pay my rent this month or do I pay for food? And even the food banks are releasing information that they are running out of their food resources. So I think we have to separate what homelessness looked like prior to March and what homelessness is going to look like in the next 12 to 24 months, because I think it's going to be, unfortunately, a very different set of people struggling through these circumstances.
Thanks, Jasmine. The next question is from Scott, and he asked, the alcohol tax was intended and passed with the understanding that substantially more than simply alcohol treatment would benefit from the tax. How will the other programs which were to be funded by the alcohol tax be funded if all of the alcohol tax is diverted into supporting alcohol treatment? And I'll just say that we clearly do not expect anywhere close to the vast majority of the alcohol tax to be used on treatment. There is certainly an amendment that will be offered by some assembly members on Tuesday night that will clearly indicate that a cap of how much can be used for the operating facilities, or paying for the operating costs of these facilities, We believe that it will likely look at about $3.5 million, which is less than a third of the total amount that we expect to bring in revenue from the alcohol tax. So the other 3 or 2 buckets that were included in the alcohol tax will clearly have plenty of funding to be able to be used. So we certainly do not expect any more than that to be spent on supporting alcohol or other treatment measures. And then I'm searching through some more questions. I might have Chris jump in on this one, which is by emergency order, the public was denied the opportunity to fill the assembly chambers during 5 nights of testimony. By emergency order, the public was shut out of the deliberations on July 27th. By emergency order, the public is shut out of witnessing the final vote on 8/11. Do you have any comment on that?
Sure, happy to address those questions. I believe the way that the question was asked is the emergency order provisions that were in effect at any given date had rules around the size of maximum allowable gatherings in a confined indoor space. And to that end, the Assembly made the decision about what size gatherings would be allowed inside the LUSAC chambers in order to still remain lawful. As the question asker pointed out, when we started down this process on the many nights of testimony, we were operating under an emergency order that had a different gathering size than the emergency order that eventually closed the chambers at the direction of the Assembly this past week. I think that's the short answer, is that to the degree that the gathering size limitations that have been in place under the different emergency orders, those have limited the size of gatherings that were allowable inside the LUSAC lane chambers. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. The next question is, I think, for Robin, which is from Aaron. The Heritage Land Bank owns approximately 10,000 acres within the municipality. Why are those lands not being discussed?
I don't think it's quite 10,000. We have a little less than that, and about 5,000 of those acres are in Girdwood. Much of it is steep slopes and not developable. We have looked at our developable properties, and we are certainly willing to look at those for long-term use for permanent supportive housing, possible emergency shelters. The problem is that it takes a long time to develop a piece of property. It's much more expensive to develop a piece of property and construct a facility. It's less expensive and much quicker to renovate current real estate that is offered for sale or willing to be sold at a much lower price. So our priority was to repurpose existing real estate rather than to create new real estate and leave existing real estate vacant.
Thank you. Carolyn, can I get you to jump in and ask the next question?
Sure thing. Let me pull this up here. I don't know if this is a question best for Jasmine or perhaps Nancy. Someone who did not give their name says, this seems like an unprecedented opportunity to fully implement the Housing First best practice. Can you cover briefly the cost effectiveness of Housing First? Nancy or Jasmine?
I'll take a stab at it and then turn it over to Nancy. For folks that are not aware, Housing First is the idea that you can best care for a person experiencing homelessness needs by first helping them attain housing. And that's for everyone. So that could be our neighbor who just lost their job, or that could be someone who has severe trauma and is struggling with much more acute issues. Housing First has been proven successful around the world. For folks that keep up with this stuff, Finland has actually completely addressed homelessness through Housing First. So when we talk about implementing that, that's a big part of the plan. Housing First in many ways is just the model behind what we call supportive housing. And so it's that mentality, again, for our most high acuity people with the most sophisticated needs, that we help them stabilize in housing with the right case management and the right services. An interesting data point from 2019, when we were having this discussions with the state about the state's budget changes around homeless services, the state of Alaska's OMB released a statement that supportive housing on average in Alaska costs $51 a day. And the two primary alternatives to supportive housing, so the only two other options that we as a community have, are corrections, which is upwards of $150 a day, or API, which, as most of you know, has very limited capacity. And API, we're now talking about over $1,000 a day. So it's interesting that not only has Housing First proved to be very effective in implementation in actually addressing and reducing street homelessness, as well as that invisible homelessness that I was talking about earlier, the thousands of people we don't see outside, but it also has proven out to be the most cost-effective solution that we have, and the wisest use of government and tax dollars in the communities that have implemented it. So we do have Housing First. The goal is to have more Housing First, but we generally in the industry, if you will, call that supportive housing. So those two terms are pretty much the same thing. Nancy, would you like to add anything?
Thank you. Yes, I would just add a note that generally communities across the country are going to housing as a model as opposed to shelter, primarily because the person is able to pay rent, they're able to contribute to the program and buy into it, if you will. And so this helps people become more stable. It helps them, it helps increase the effectiveness of the programs. People feel safer. They can have a door where they can actually lock their door and feel safe at night. And generally we see that reductions of drinking go down when people are in housing programs, roughly by 1/3. Many studies have shown, and that their mental health increases. So people feel better, they're able to engage, and they're contributing. And so this is one of the reasons why this model is becoming much more widely used.
Thanks, Nancy. And I'm going to have the next question for you as well, which is there advantage to owning and operating more but smaller facilities throughout the municipality versus a larger centralized facility?
One of the things that the Anchored Home Plan has examined is the number of beds needed across the community. And there is generally the thought that you need some of everything. You need some potential fourplexes in locations. You need some larger locations where you can have more people who require services in one location. So your economy of scale on your services works better. And you need to have locations that are distributed near grocery stores, near employment opportunities, near bus lines. And so a balanced community, a balance in terms of location across the community and size of living opportunities is really what we should be striving for.
And then the next question, again, I'll kick it to you, Nancy, is are drinking and drug use going to be allowed at any of these facilities?
the facilities will be working with people in a model that is meeting them where they are. And for the congregate shelter facility in particular, there will be no drinking or drugs allowed in that location. That doesn't mean if a person is intoxicated that they would be turned away, but there will not be drugs or alcohol on that site. Other locations, when a person has an apartment, there can be legal substances that people use. However, the staffing and the engagement begin to work with people immediately on identifying where they may have issues with addiction and mental health, and getting into treatment services so that those conditions can be controlled and they can move into sobriety or healing and employment and begin stabilizing.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. We have reached 7:30. We obviously have not been able to get through all of the questions that we have received, but I did want to point out that there are a number of other ways for folks to be able to participate in the assembly meetings as we are going forward. Folks can sign up for over the phone testimony. You can stream the meeting or watch the meeting on Channel 9, as well as streaming the meeting online through YouTube, which I believe is a new feature. If you go to muni.org and the assembly page, I believe it will take you to YouTube. So there will be a number of ways for individuals to still participate and watch the assembly meeting. And we certainly hope that folks will tune in on Tuesday night as we discuss this issue, as well as the much larger package of Karzak funding that we will get approval, hopefully, from the Assembly on. And we look forward to hearing testimony on that. So with that, thank you, everyone, for attending tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you.